Hi, how are you? Today is Monday, November 28. One family, his decades, Myriad views of Fidel Castro's revolution. Havana, when Fidel Castro rode in victoriously into Havana on January 8, 1959, Juan Montessori reached into the streets to cheer. A poor, uneducated laborer from the western countryside of Cuba. He had arrived in the capital in a few years earlier and, like most of his neighbors, could hardly believe what was happening. It was an emotional shock, Mr. Mount said. These bearded men, poorly dressed, they won, and on behalf of the lower classes. Mr. Mount, who was 25 at the time, stayed loyal to Mr. Castro, who died on Friday. From that moment, the Castro revolution gave him an education, a home, and a job as a police officer who sometimes guarded the commandant himself. But that allegiance slipped from generation to generation in Mr. Mount's family and Cuba as a whole. His son's views darkened decades ago. During tussles with the Castro government's restrictions, his teenage granddaughter, Rocio, has spent most of her young feeling gloom about the conditions in her country. There are too many Cubans who get up every day and struggle, and that's it, she said in an interview. My dream is to live. The Mount family's story of faith and disillusions is common. Cuban families have been arguing about Mr. Castro since he came to power. His death has again produced an intensive clash of emotions for many Cubans who recognized that he was more than just a political figure. He was also a brother and father and a grandfather to various Cuban generations, a familiar presence whose ideals, wins, and ego shaped everyone's identity and daily life. Whether they wanted him around or not, Fidel was there, with his 4-hour speeches, his billboards, and the grandiose absolutes. Socialismo o muerte, socialism or death. That helped produce early triumphs in education and health care, along with the restrictions on speech and assembly and, later on, persistent economic failures. His relationship with the country was remarkably personal. Robert A. Pastor, a former Latin American advisor to President Jim Carter, used to say that Mr. Castro was one of the few world leaders referred to by just their first names. Many Cubans have grown comfortable with calling him a complicated relative. You have to look at this in a very cool way. This is like the father who has been there all the time, that has taken the family through thinking and thinking. Carlos Azugaray Treto, a former Cuban diplomat, said in an interview on Saturday, maybe at times you don't agree with him, but most of the time you agree with what he has done. Yet Mr. Castro was not exactly a common-loved one. He was also the maximum leader, charismatic but quick to anger, and guerrilla whose name Cubans were often afraid to enter, because he ruled for decades. Mr. Castro's impact and the perception of it changed over time. Cubans born before their revolution saw him as a transformative force to good or ill. Those born later, especially after the Soviet Union started collapsing in 1989, then view him as an obdurate barrier to economic opportunity and to integration with the rest of the world. In life, he was often an enigma, in that for Cuban families like the Monteses, he is a colleague of the competing images, from the inspiring young rebel to the out-of-touch old man. The father, Mr. Montes first heard of the Barbudos or bearded rebels when he was picking coffee and fruit in the fields in the Cuba's eastern province of the Guantanamo. It was the early 1950s, and the poor farmers in the area had started banding together, revolting against wealthy Londoners. Mr. Castro was among many leaders said to be demand better working conditions. On July 26, 1953, Mr. Castro started his first major attack, raiding the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, now the country's second largest city. Mr. Castro was caught and defended himself in the court. 3 months later, with a lengthy speech that included the line, "History will absolve me." Mr. Montes has decided by then to move to Havana and to root for Mr. Castro and his guerrillas. There was a lot of injustice back then. Mr. Montes said, "Coups, crimes. The government didn't care at all for the people. Compared with the neighbors, Cuba was well off, with a per capita income in 1958 that was exceeded in Latin America by only Argentina and Venezuela, according to United Nations statistics. But the Cuban economy was essentially stuck in place, with yawning inequality in rural areas like those areas. Mr. Montes grew up. More than 19% of the homes lacked the electricity. In Havana, the streets were clogged with a mix of shark fin Cadillacs and ragtag beggars. After taking power in 1959, Mr. Castro promised radical change. "We have fought to give democracy and liberty to our people," he said days after his triumphant arrival in Havana. He delivered. Mr. Montes said, over the next few months, the Castro government announced the plans for land reform to grant property to the poor, taxes of 80% on expensive cars, and additional government spending to decrease unemployment. In December that year, Mr. Montes was hired as policy officer. It was his first steady job since his arrival in Havana, and came with free schooling, leading him from a 4th grade education to a high school diploma. The pride he felt at his rise into the middle class can be seen in family pictures from that era, with his wife wearing new necklaces beside her smiling husband. Even in his 18s, he speaks of his first few years on the police force with the excitement of the new cadet. "When some committed a crime, we arrest them, but always with a sense of justice," he said. "We didn't abuse anyone. It was a process for everyone. It wasn't just for the upper classes." From the outside, especially in Washington, Mr. Castro seemed to be upending Cuba's justice system, summarily executing opponent and filling Cuban jails. Mr. Montes, however, said he had seen a police force once viewed as a collection of the corrupt thugs becoming professional From 1959 to 1962, Mr. Mount said Cubans all over the country were eager to serve Mr. Castro, but there were enemies close by, mostly wealthier Cuban exiles who had fled when Mr. Castro began nationalizing property. They had the support of the United States, and when their attack came at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, Mr. Mons was guarding the home of Celia Sanchez, a famous guerrilla fighter and Mr. Castro's longtime lover and confidant. Around 4 a.m., Mr. Mons said there was a flurry of activity inside. Moments later, Mr. Castro emerged surrounded by armed escorts. He looked calm. Mr. Mons said no one knew what was happening. No one knew they attacked us. The Cuban Missile Crisis and the American trade embargo only strengthened the siege mentality that Mr. Castro held on for decades, as he argued repeatedly that Cuba must remain under tight control lest the Northern imperialists invade and turn the island into an American fief. In an interview in late 2012, Mr. Mons said he had never questioned that assessment, even when he was with critics of the Mr. Castro's authoritarian ways. In 1970, during the government's effort to harvest a record 10 million tons of sugar, Mr. Mons helped guard 300 political prisoners forced to cut sugar cane. Mr. Mons said that had not seemed to be bad people, but he said it was sounded like a touch of disappointment. They were wrong. The uncertain legacy of Fidel Castro. The small country of Cuba, which has long played an outsized role in world politics, faces an uncertain future after the death of an icon of the revolutionary left. He said he had often felt the same way about relatives who at times were critical of Mr. Castro, including some who had moved to the United States. The revolution is a process, he said, shifting in his seat on the Florida couch at his home in the Vedado neighborhood of Havana. He looked toward his son's house next door. They don't see things very clearly, he said. They don't realize that they have the greatest opportunity in the world. They have the opportunity to study. He said which the younger Cuban in his family could see the broader context. We were a poor, uneducated, humble family before the revolution, he said. Then there was a change, a radical change that is still maturing. The sun. The entrance to Juan Carlos' home covered in the green vines, with bunkers of the bitter grapes. More than a decade ago, he ran a private restaurant on Paladar beneath the greenery. He also used to rent rooms to tourists. He developed a new business in which he used his newly acquired Spanish passport to travel to Panama to buy clothes and other items to sell in Havana. He is a member of what might be called the resolver generation. Thus was learned to resolve or negotiate their way around the shortages regulations and inefficiencies of Cuban socialism in its later stages. If his father's image of the Mr. Castro and the revolution was shaped by the changes of the 1950s or 60s, his views have been sculpted by the transitions from the flush 1980s to the scavenging 90s. The shift was significant. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost a patron that had provided around $4 billion a year in credits and subsidies. The economy contracted by 34% from 1990 to 1993, with chronic shortage of food, just about everything. Cuban officials acknowledged in 1990 that his countries had entered a special period. The implication was that Cuba would need to make some exceptions to the norm. In 1993, Mr. Castro legalized the American dollar and allowed Cubans to become self-employed in dozens of industries, especially those serving tourists. Scholars still debate the degree to which Cuba adopted capitalism in that period, but Juan Carlos was one of the many who took advantage. He was 31 at the time, and had already become frustrated with the way the Castro government worked. In his 20s, he worked at Cuba Customs Agency as his father, and after his tenure of the police force. Was Juan Carlos so, he said, was an anti-democratic system that rewarded silence instead of the initiative. He said his frustration peaked in the late 1980s when he was rebuffed by Communist Party officials for gathering recommendations from colleagues for improving the agenda. He believed that he was doing what socialism revered, organizing works. But the party guys, he said, they just told me, that's not right. Here are the things we are going to talk about, and you doesn't stop up and talk. Juan Carlos shook and laughed as if expressing a sentiment that Cubans have long relied on to describe run-ins with the government. No es fácil. It's not easy. He left his job just before the Soviet Union's collapse. Of the next few years, he found work in hotel. When Mr. Castro legalized a small restaurant, Juan Carlos decided to open one with his wife, but there was a problem. He needed permission from the local committee for the defense of the revolution, the neighborhood party watchdog, and the group had not met in years. So he nominated himself to lead the group and got his neighbors to support his candidates. I became the president so I could open the restaurant, he said. The Castro government was never far away. However, the 1990s led to relative economic openness, but its fifth and started as Mr. Castro and his brother Raul, who took over presidential powers in 2006. Limited change businesses must stay small under laws that restrict how many employees can be hired. Supplies must be bought from the government, and crackdowns are common. Even as relations with the United States have improved, begin with the reopened embassies and President Obama's visit this year, the economic life of the island remained constricted by Cuba's loyalty to central control. It's like accordion. They open little, they close. Juan Carlos said, but they never open up all the way. Success there has tended to play favorite economic and racial inequality. After improving in the early years of the revolution, has gotten worse since the 1990s. Cuba with small businesses and more lucrative jobs in tourism are typically lighter skinned with advantages built up over time. Some have relatives in Miami. Others have connections in government or, in the case of the Juan Carlos, Spanish ancestry and a home in Vedado with extra space. He acknowledged that he had done relatively well through much hard work. During one winter visit, he popped a tape into a VCR showing his daughter's quinceañera, her 15th birthday party at the Hotel Nacional. The girl, Rocio, wore a light full-length gown and thanked her parents as the guests drank and danced. It looked like a small broom, but from Juan Carlos and especially from his daughter, one night of the fun is nowhere near enough to create contentment. The granddaughter, Rocio, dreams of becoming an art historian, though and young. She described Cuba with the nuanced sophistication that comes from a good education and plenty of time to think things through. In her eyes, Cuba is purgatory, and even before he died. Mr. Castro was a spectre of the past, studied in the textbooks more than seen. Fidel had an enormous vision, she said. And yes, there are a lot of things she said she loved about Mr. Castro's Cuba. The breezy liberty of the streets, crime-free, and rarely snatched with traffic. The emphasis on education and culture. She said she sometimes feared that the violence would return once Fidel and Raúl Castro were gone. But mostly as she has grown from adolescence to adulthood, she was wanted to leave. Her older sister already lives in Spain. Her best friend went to Miami for a vacation on summer and stayed, telling Rocio about the crowded shopping malls and the impressive facilities at her new school. Most of the Rocio's friends, she said, hope to get out of Cuba as soon as they can. My generation were not worried about the politics or ideals, she said. We just want to get out. Abroad, you can achieve so much more. You can be recognized for your work internationally, but the world. Fidel Castro's era of peak ideology and the cold, warm standoffish of is not what today's ambitious young people want. Like many young Cubans, Rocio mostly wants Cuba to catch up. Why is there no open and affordable access to the internet? Why can't she easily get on Facebook to say hi to her sister in Barcelona? Why is it so hard to visit the Louvre in person or virtually? I think everyone has a right to get the information they want to think and study, she said. She said that the American trade embargo clearly did not help, but that most young people considered their own government responsible for creating a society of limits. Fidel and Raúl started out with a good idea, she said. They just didn't achieve that they said they would achieve. She wants the same things her grandfather and Fidel Castro wanted when they were young: radical change and the fair shot at making a life for herself on her terms. The change of the past few years under Raul Castro, allowing more private enterprise and travel, offered some hope, she said, but it's not changing of the peace in the past. It needs to. Fidel Castro is gone. He was a man of the 20th century, Mont said in an interview on Saturday night, and his granddaughter has long been ready to move on. We don't have time to wait, she said. Now in Cuba, after Fidel Castro, they think will change? I don't know. You need to wait. Thank you very much to watch my new videos. If you want to learn English or only conversation classes, come here in Classe Projeto de Idiomas or by Skype. Here there are my contacts on Facebook, my page on Facebook, my email and my WhatsApp. Give a like please on my page, on my YouTube channel, sharing my videos. It's all. Okay, thank you very much. See you tomorrow. Bye.